All right. We left the class on this slide on Friday. This is a archaeological excavation drawing on a building complex from the Zhou dynasty. And this is from the Western Zhou dynasty. Just to be aware that in historical periodization of the Zhou dynasty, there is a Western Zhou period, there's an Eastern Zhou period. The Western Zhou period is an earlier period of the Zhou dynasty, roughly from the mid-11th century BCE to about 770 BCE. It's called the Western Zhou because the capital during this period is in Xi'an, which is in the western part of China. And so it's referred to just for the convenience of our historical reference. We call it Western Zhou. And Eastern Zhou period, in the year 770 BCE, the capital was relocated to the city of Luoyang. And the city of Luoyang is to the east of Xi'an. So it served as the capital of the Zhou dynasty from 770 BCE to 256 BCE. So, excuse me. So we call this period 8th century to mid-3rd century BCE, the Eastern Zhou period. So they are not like two contemporary competing regimes. No, they are kind of two successive period, and the rulers and the people of the period just call themselves the Zhou people, the Zhou dynasty, and the Western and the Eastern is added by later historians just for the convenience of discussion. So architectural remains from the Western Zhou period is especially rare. So for the Eastern Zhou period, after the 8th century BCE, there are relatively more archaeological data. Many capitals of the kind of local kingdoms, local states had been discovered and excavated. So we know fairly well of the later period of the Zhou dynasty. But for the earlier period, the Western Zhou dynasty, we know very little. Not even the capital, not even the kind of royal mausoleums had been discovered, which is kind of well, if you consider for the Shang dynasty, which is before the Zhou dynasty, a lot of royal tombs had been discovered and excavated, but for the Zhou period, Western Zhou period, the royal tombs are still a mystery. So we know very little. And for their palaces, we know even less. So this discovery is a important one because it provides a rare glimpse into the architecture of the Western Zhou period. Otherwise we would rely heavily on the kind of secondary images, carved on bronze and from, other sculptural or two-dimensional images about architecture. So this discovery showed a fairly large complex, which kind of continued those Neolithic characteristics of courtyard complexes, but was, given much greater regular form. The symmetry and the axiality of the complex is much more exactly kind of observed in the design. It shows a complex with two courtyards, a front courtyard, which is just one courtyard without any division, and then a back courtyard that is divided into two halves by a central elevated corridor or ground. Both courtyards are in square. The front one is a rectangular square, and then the back one, the rectangle was divided into two square by a central corridor. And the entire complex is also in a rectangular shape, slightly indented in the front to have the side rooms kind of embracing and defining a entrance space that shows a kind of a more welcoming space prepared for the entrance. The entrance is in the very center of the southern walls. So in another word, the complex is also very well oriented along a north-south axis. So in this map, this plan, again, that arrow is pointing north. So it's cardinally oriented, and the main entrance is in the south. And all the buildings, their opening side are also facing south, which is a very standard orientation in classical Chinese architecture. The whole complex is elevated on a platform, so a elevated ground support those buildings. And around the courtyard, there are corridors, goes all around, or a veranda. So last time when we were looking at Shang Dynasty architecture, we compare the archaeological discovery with paleographical sources, the words, meaning veranda. And we know that veranda is open on one side and walled on the other side. So this Zhou Dynasty example also shows that character perfectly. So around the courtyards, there are veranda, and they are open to the courtyard, and then next to the wall of the surrounding rooms. So southern orientation surrounding veranda around the courtyard, which organize all the different rooms together, and a central southern entrance, elevated ground. So the veranda had a kind of a connection in the middle of the back courtyard that divided the back courtyard into two smaller ones. So that is likely to have a roof as well, because there are kind of columns right in, in the middle. The rooms are of consistent shape and a consistent size. They are small, and about 3 to 2 meters wide and 5 meters long. Each of this room, for example, so it's not very big. This dimension is about 5 meters. That is about 15 feet. And this dimension is about 2 to 3 meters, which is, less than 10 feet. So small rooms, each one have doors and windows facing the courtyard, for understandably for light and for ventilation. The building is also constructed with wooden frame. So column pits had been discovered at the in the center of the walls, and then the walls are of earth, constructed with earth. So this building, its significance again is in its kind of a great regularity and the exact measurement and execution of a rectangular plan that is very consistent to the later generation development in official or palatial Chinese architecture. And this is also discovered at a place where the Zhou royal family started. So it is not in the capital city of Xi'an, but in a location in the place called Fengchu. And the Fengchu is the place where the Zhou royal family began. They built their kind of a dynastic foundation in that location. So it is clearly connected to the royal Zhou family. But regarding whether this is a palace or it is a ritual sacrificial architecture, there's no agreement. There's a debate. We used to think this is a palace, but later some scholars believe it is more kind of like a ritual architecture, because ritual objects like the auricle bone had been discovered in a complex. But even if it is not a residential palace, it demonstrates a lot of characteristic, again, consistent to later palace architecture, as well as kind of making a nice link to previous kind of residential architecture as well. For example, I mentioned the courtyard in the front is bigger, courtyard in the back is smaller, and the hall, which is located in the very middle, is also a big one, right? Its size is much bigger than the surrounding rooms. And then the rooms in the back, 3 of them of exactly the same size, showing great consistency and accuracy, are small, but still slightly bigger than the side ones. So this might be based on the archetypal palatial architectural arrangement, which has bigger halls in the front, in the southern area, for ceremonial purposes, and then the back smaller rooms as kind of sleeping chambers, more residential part. So for palatial architecture, usually the southern part is ceremonial, and then the northern part, which is hidden with more privacy in the back, are the actual kind of residential part, you know, sleeping chambers. We will see that in the future lectures, the Forbidden City, for example, is arranged in this way, even though with much greater kind of scale, in much greater scale, and spread on a much larger plot. But here, the characteristic of the space demonstrate the same kind of spatial preference, bigger spaces in the front for more ceremonial public purposes, and smaller rooms in the north, in the back, for more private kind of daily usage. This is consistent not only to future palaces in Chinese history, but also to the Neolithic big house. You know, we looked at this big house from the Yangshao culture, which is prehistoric, earlier than the Zhou dynasty, earlier than Shang dynasty, earlier than Xia dynasty as well. This is Neolithic, but we find the same kind of spatial arrangement. Closer to the entrance, we have that big space. And interestingly, in the back, the rooms were also divided into kind of 3 smaller rooms. Even though this one has no courtyard, this is just one big building and divided internally into smaller spaces, but it demonstrates the same kind of spatial preference. Maybe it's a residence for a chieftain. Maybe it is a kind of a common house for the entire tribe. Nonetheless, the consistency of spatial arrangement is quite noteworthy. So, and this is not a secondary reconstruction based on images. This is from direct kind of footprint of a ancient building from archaeological site. So throughout the 3 dynasties of Xia, Shang, and Zhou, from 4,000 years ago to about 2,300 years ago, the wall of Chinese architecture, Chinese cities were constructed with rammed earth. So the rammed earth is a way of building a wall with the help of wooden planks. So in order to build a rammed earth wall, this is from an illustration of an old book, old kind of Chinese dictionary, showing how a rammed earth wall is constructed. So you have these wooden planks defining the width of the wall, and then people pounding the earth within to form solid substance. And with the rise of the height of the wall, the wooden frame needed to be elevated step by step, and they were also secured by ropes. So the 2 side planks are kind of secured in their distance with ropes. So this rammed earth wall in archaeological remains, they shows two features differentiating them from a natural pile of dirt, in that first they are layered because the rammed earth wall were constructed layer by layer. So these rammed earth remains has a layer. That's the first characteristic. And secondly, they have kind of small holes within. That is because of the rope kind of securing the distance of these wooden planks. So this is why when archaeologists, dig into the earth and found something, and they believe that used to be a wall, because these rammed earth walls, the dirt left by the rammed earth walls are different from those natural dirt, natural earth. So this is the main way for constructing a wall. They are of rammed earth. So they cannot hold load, those heavy load. As a result, the walls in traditional Chinese architecture are usually just of, for privacy, for protective purposes. The load-bearing elements are the wooden frame. So you have wooden frames supporting the roof, and these walls are constructed to divide the space and to protect the privacy. A problem of this rammed earth wall, of course, is the the waterproof problem. So it cannot be damped or submerged or wet by the rainwater. So as a result, the Chinese roof needs to be overhanging, trying to throw away the rainwater further from the wall. Later, especially after the Han Dynasty, and after the bricks were mass-produced and used more, so for those important buildings, a surface veneer of brick surface are usually put around rammed earth. And then, after the Ming Dynasty, most walls for buildings are constructed with bricks. But for the city wall, rammed earth continued to be used throughout Chinese history. And after Ming Dynasty, more city walls were also surfaced with brick veneer. But the earlier period, the kind of just rammed earth for the wall with simple plaster to protect the surface is very common. So these old images shows, on one hand, the construction of a wall for a building and the construction of a wall for an entire city. And this one is from a later period. So the bricks were, you can see here on this corner, all right? Bricks were used to construct the frame for the wall so that the rammed earth in the middle does not need to use the wooden plank for the construction. So you can simply build up the masonry framing for the thick wall first, and then put the rammed earth in the middle. In Chinese, the same term, same character is used for both a city and a wall. So the Chinese word for city and wall are, pretty much synonymous, which indicate the significance of wall for Chinese architecture and Chinese city. Show you another remains from the Zhou period. This is a bronze protective end for a wooden architectural member. All right, so this one is from the Eastern Zhou period, and this is a beam end. So this is the end of a wooden beam made of bronze. The mortise tenon joint is the weak part of wooden structure. So this kind of metal end part helped to secure that joint, make that joint more kind of stronger, and at the same time decorate the wooden member as well. So those intricate patterns were also carved on the surface of this protective end. So it's, on one hand, it is structural, it is protective. On the other hand, it is also decorative. So this is a characteristic of Chinese architecture that we will see again and again, that a lot of the decoration were developed or evolved from those functional part. And eventually, when in later Chinese architecture, when these kind of a metal end was abandoned due to kind of better way to make the joint, especially after the wide usage of dougong, of the brackets. So these protective parts were no longer needed. This pattern survived in the form of painting on Chinese beam and Chinese kind of lintels in traditional Chinese architecture. So we will see this kind of characteristic triangular pattern on Chinese wooden frame painting. And that is kind of from the developed, that pattern was developed from the earlier Bronze Age architecture using bronze protective part for those wooden members. This is basically what I'm talking about, all right? So these are the bronze protective parts from the Zhou dynasty, and the way they are used to secure a joint, to strengthen those wooden parts that were kind of narrowed to make the joint, to give them greater support. So there are L-shaped ones for the joint of two wooden members joined at their end to make a corner. You know, there were also straight one, you know, where, you know, two additional members are combined to that vertical parts. So this is a drawing of a Qing dynasty wooden frame painting. So this is pure wood. So there's no metal part for the joint at all, but the painting on the surface kind of mimic those earlier metal end. So we see here a transition from utilitarian form to pure decorative form. A lot of architectural decorations are developed from the practical form. The form used to have an actual function, all right? But eventually, when technology changed, when material changed, those earlier practical form became decorative. This is a very consistent phenomenon, not only in Chinese architecture, but also in some other architectural tradition as well. For example, Greek temples, a lot of the kind of marble decoration, decoration carved into the marble were actually survived motifs from the earlier wooden construction. So for those of you who have taken architecture 1310, you should know what I'm talking about. All right, so we know relatively little about Zhou dynasty architecture, but we covered most areas we know about that kind of long dynasty from more than 2,000 years ago.